Our second reading comes from Psalm 51, 1 through 17. Have mercy on me, O God, according to your steadfast love. According to your abundant mercy, blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. For I know my transgressions and my sin is ever before me. Against you, you alone have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight, so that you are justified in your sentence and blameless when you pass judgment. Indeed, I was born guilty, a sinner when my mother conceived me. You desire truth in the inward being. Therefore, teach me wisdom in my secret heart. Purge me with hyssop, and I shall be clean. Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow. Let me hear joy and gladness. Let the bones that you have crushed rejoice. Hide your face from my sins and blot out all my iniquities. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and put a new and right spirit within me. Do not cast me away from your presence, and do not take your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation, and sustain in me a willing spirit. Then I will teach transgressors your ways, and sinners will return to you. Deliver me from bloodshed, O God of my salvation, and my tongue will sing aloud of your deliverance. O Lord, open my lips, and my mouth will declare your praise, for you have no delight in sacrifice. If I were to give a burnt offering, you would not be pleased. The sacrifice acceptable to God is a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart, O God, you will not despise. So tonight I want to talk about an acceptable sacrifice, because we're going into Lent. And I think that we want to jump through Lent and maybe have a joyous Palm Sunday and then skip over to Easter. And yay, now we can rejoice. I think that's what we want, but is that where we are? Because I don't think that even in our day-to-day lives, not just in Lent, not just on Ash Wednesday, not on Good Friday only, those moments when we are taught that we need to sit and contemplate our mortality, to sit with our brokenness, to reflect upon how much we need Christ, Christ in that moment of salvation, but also in the day-to-day with us, God Emmanuel. Because when I look in our communities, I see people that are so sad. That you turn on the news, and it's horrific. And not just the horrors of war. This poor girl, you're crossing the street in St. Louis and is hit by a car and has lost both her legs. These are just the horrors of day-to-day life that we're surrounded by. And I think that we are a suffering people. And so often we stay busy and we stay distracted. And Lent is so important for us to just acknowledge that we're hurting. I think that there is an appropriateness to us setting aside those little things that we set aside for Lent, hopefully with maybe not much, but a tiny bit more seriousness than the New Year's resolutions that we know we're not going to keep. Because do we ever keep those? What's the average? A week and a half? And then we're back to whatever it is. I think that when we look at Isaiah, when we look in the Psalms, that what we see is these statements of this is the sacrifice we want to give. And it's an easy, tiny little sacrifice. You know, for most of us, the world isn't made better by the fact that the little things that we give up for Lent. You know, I was introduced to Lent. You know, I was raised Baptist. You know, we don't do Lent in that tradition. So I was introduced to Lent when I went to college. And I had a professor, and I was doing an independent study with him. And during Lent, I walked into his office, and he said, and in fact, I wasn't even doing an independent study at that point. I was just going to ask a question. And he said, "Oh, thank God, here." And he hands me half a sandwich. I was like, "Why?" He said, "It's Lent, and I'm supposed to give up half my sandwich. That's what I promised." And so every day whoever walked by his office, he'd give half a sandwich. I don't think that his character was deepened by the fact that he was eating only half a bologna sandwich every day. But that was because that's what he brought. It's like, is that the sacrifice that's acceptable to God? It's not what Isaiah is saying. It's not what Psalm is saying. You know, the Isaiah passage is our opening, our call to worship. Is this not the fast that God chooses? To loose the bonds of injustice, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke. We are to share our bread with the hungry, bring the homeless poor into our house, clothe the naked, and not hide ourselves from our own kin. How often are we hiding ourselves not only from our own kin, but from ourselves? Because we're not willing to acknowledge the pain that we're carrying, the pain of our loved ones, the fears that we have, and be willing to turn that over in our community and to God. To look at the world that we have created and say, surely to goodness we can do better here. Surely the little actions can start building something better than what we see on the news or the fights that are happening behind closed doors, the struggles that we face, the sicknesses that we hide, the fears that we have. Because when we are bound in those fear and pain and suffering and anger and frustration and all the rest, we are holding back ourselves. How do we live into our call to be fully present with one another, covenanted together as Christians, as members of a church, members of a community, members of a family, members of a nation? How have we let our nation get to the point that it's in? This isn't a left or right issue. This is how are we not human to one another? How are we not listening to God's call? When I turn to this piece in Corinthians, and this is where I feel called out. I mean, count Psalm and Isaiah as well. By purity, knowledge, patience, kindness, holiness of spirit, genuine love, truthful speech, and the power of God. We've got access to all of that. But how often do we turn away from it? We have these weapons of righteousness for the right hand and for the left, in honor and in dishonor, in ill repute and good repute, because there are people that are going to willfully misinterpret what we're doing. There are people that are going to misrepresent us. And that's just part of being alive. But in good times and bad, we have access to these weapons of kindness and hope and trust and love and companionship. We are treated as imposters, yet we're true, as unknown, and yet are well known, as dying and see we are alive. You know, how much fear are we putting on the fact that our tiny little churches are dying? And yet we are alive. Are we going to act like we're alive? Are we going to live into the fact that we really are alive, not dead? Change, certainly, and change is a fearsome thing. You know, we may not be alive in the same way we were 10 years ago, or 20, or 50, or 100. You know, that's life. You know, and yet we live. They say we're dying, and see we are alive. As punished, and yet not killed. As sorrowful, yet always rejoicing. As poor, yet making many rich. As having nothing, and yet possessing everything. When I look at this, as sorrowful, yet always rejoicing, you know, that's hitting me where I live, because I look at the world around us, and it's hard for me not to fall into despair. I look at people I love that I know can be living into God's call for them, and yet instead I see people who are doing abusive things, that are hurting one another, that are misinterpreting willfully. We're called to be better than that. We can be better than that. And it is hard sometimes for me to hang on to the hope, to even in the moments of sorrow, to yet still rejoice. Because God, Emmanuel, God is with us. God is calling us to be transformed. That's what we saw Sunday. Are we willing to be transformed? And part of that means we've got to sit and acknowledge the pain and the suffering, the sorrows, the missteps. We've got to look inward and say, what ways am I damaging myself? What ways am I turning away from the true sacrifice that God is calling us to live into? And that is joy, service, sacrifice, not have a bologna sandwich, but truly believing that this world can be better because we are in it. And somehow, even on the bad days, being able to step up and say, today, I can live into my call. And I can be the person God is calling me to be. That when we are in a situation that traps us, to believe that there's a way out. And be willing to step into that. I'm thinking now about, I don't know how many of you have seen it, the movie Inside Out. The ones with the little kids. I saw that in the theater on the opening day, and there were 2 kids, and it was a packed theater, and all of the adults were bawling their eyes out through the whole thing. The only thing that was more traumatic than that movie was Up. But it's brilliant, because here is joy. And joy, we want to hang on to that newness, that excitement. We want to live on the milk that Paul talks about. But we've got to get to the point that we live on the grown-up food. And sometimes that's hard to digest, it's hard to swallow. So in this movie, what you see is joy and sadness having to work together so this little girl grows up. And isn't that what life honestly is about? We can't turn our backs when it gets hard. We can't stay in that joy of little kidness, because our kids are facing things we could not imagine. They at a younger and younger age, joy and sadness are having to hold hands so those kids can grow up. Lent is that process of joy and sadness holding hands so we can move forward, so we can face the world that's before us, knowing that God is at our side. That's what maturing in faith is. It's why the story of Jacob struggling with that angel, receiving a blessing but walking away with a limp, is so powerful for me, because that's what it means to mature. We can't stay in that childhood joy. We have to put away the childish things. And that's what the season of Lent is, of sitting in our darkness, of turning and facing our despair, of recognizing how terrible we have screwed up, and then still finding hope, knowing God is with us, and coming out the other side, still able in joy and love and faith and hope to face the hard realities of the world. And that's why we need one another. It's why we need the church to hold on, to support us as we move forward. I pray that in this season of Lent, that we offer an acceptable sacrifice. Yes, if it helps you to give up chocolate, give up chocolate. There's nothing wrong with that. But don't think that that's what God is calling us to do. God's calling us to so much more. But we have to go through the darkness in order to get to the light. And the light's coming. I pray that you can hold on to that you do the hard work necessary, because otherwise we are trying to live off the milk of the Spirit when we need something meatier. If you're able, please stand.